So again, I touched on this just a moment ago, but all our practices are trying to reinforce those three elements of integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices to support those three elements of cycling resources, promoting ecological balance, and conserving diversity. Basically, in a nutshell, here's kind of the 10,000-foot view of organic. A healthy soil creates healthy plants. So we want all our actions to support the health of plants, particularly when dealing with perennial crops. We want to make sure we're starting off well and maintaining that. The healthy plants resist. So that's a key, that we're not having to rescue them. We're not having to come in with treatments. A diverse mix of species within the production area allows for things such as beneficial insects, predators, things of that nature. And a fully integrated system, as much as possible, eliminates the need for off-farm resources. So again, trying to conserve and cycle resources on the farm whenever possible to help support these goals. Site-specific, soils vary, across this room there's any number of different soil types and everything, but always looking at what is the soil test telling us, what are the needs of the plant as we progress in production, if we're doing tissue samples and things of that nature, or just looking at yields, what's actually needed in the location. Climate, obviously it can vary, but we know, with planting with various fruit crops, whether you're planting on the bottom of a hill or the top of a hill or the shoulder, it has different issues to it. What's happening around you? That's very specific on current activities, and what's your objective and market demand. So, it may be a scenario where maybe not all your production fields are in a position to be certified, maybe because of conflict with adjacent use or some other limiting factors. It is possible to have part of your operation as certified and part of it as not. So these are all factors they can take into consideration. I thought, and this was actually some slides I stole from SARE. They're a sustainable agricultural research organization, do a lot of good work. And what I like about it, it kind of puts some of this into concept for you. So within organic production, you don't really have good herbicide options, in my personal opinion. There are some products out there that are labeled, that are allowed, but they don't really do a good job. And so really, I never try to push people towards organic herbicides. I try to have them approach it from other cultural practices that will give them good controls. So this is an example of where they had good crop rotation within the field. They used a winter cover crop that they helped suppress weeds. They then planted in peppers, they hoed it, and then they used mulch to keep down weeds. And if you look really closely, there are some weeds there, but they're not under a significant pressure, not a significant threat. And that's because they use multiple different options. They came in, they did, physical removal, they did mulching. And so depending on your crop, there are still options for things like weed control without the conventional chemical controls. But it sometimes takes a little more planning or a little more physical effort. So lots of times organic crops seem to have more labor requirements. And it's because oftentimes you're using labor to substitute for some other practices. Example of this, whenever you're taking materials and composting it, one thing you're doing is you're managing manure. You're taking a product that maybe you already have on your farm and putting it to use for something else. The compost process helps stabilize the nutrients. It will kill the weed seeds, pathogens, and then it provides a valuable soil amendment. So there's multiple reasons why we might want to do something like compost and utilize it within a certified organic production. So what compost is acceptable for use in certified organic? The regulations actually have a specific definition of compost. It relates to temperatures and turnings, depending on the exact production method, whether it's a static aerated pile or a turn pile. And so that is what identifies compost. And when I say compost, I'm saying that specifically. What we often find is on a farm is they will have, manure or other stuff that has sat there a while, has broken down. It's clearly no longer manure from a visual perspective. But because it hasn't gone through this specific process within the regulations, it's still regarded as manure, even if it's 2 years old or 3 years old. If we're talking about plant-based matter, there's no restrictions on it. The restrictions on timing, and the difference between compost and manure is when you're allowed to use it within the production cycle. Manure has the 90 and 120 day rule, which says depending on whether a crop's in direct contact with the ground or above it, the latest it could be applied is 90 or 120 days prior to harvest. You may remember that from good agricultural practices training. And so it's an issue of food safety is what they're trying to address there. Compost that's properly produced goes through a process that reduces or eliminates the pathogen load, and therefore you can use it anytime. A plant-based compost that doesn't come with animal manures or other animal byproducts doesn't have the same threat to food safety, therefore there's no restrictions on it. So plant matter can be used anytime, whether it's composted or a raw mulch or a cover crop that's turned under or anything. Municipal yard waste can be a source of material that can be used. There does come one caveat with that. There are some herbicides that are persistent. There have been issues where people have bought in compost or yard waste materials and the herbicide was there and obviously it didn't work well because growing crops and herbicide applications to it don't turn out that great. Depending on what your source is, there's no direct absolute requirement that you test it. It would be better to really understand well what the source is. For instance, if it's tree waste, an herbicide is much less likely than if it was true yard waste with yard clippings and things of that nature. So I think know the source intimately so you know exactly where it's coming from. And there's any number of companies that do have products that are pre-approved by review agencies, and lots of them do testing already for herbicide, and we can talk about that here in a minute. Cover cropping is another method that's highly advantageous to use in organic production. With the perennial cropping system, it's a little bit harder to do that, but you can still look at your row middles and things like that as possible opportunities to do that. It's a very great way to cycle nutrients into the system with a minimal cost. One thing we want to do with organic production is give the plants everything they need, but at the same time not give them excess. So there are restrictions within the regulations that for micronutrient applications, you actually have to demonstrate a need for those. You can't just apply them prescriptively without some sort of basis. So that is something to be aware of. It's also a scenario where while you can use certain organic pesticides like insect controls or disease controls, you have to first use other methods such as cultural controls, variety selection, and things of that nature. And then when those fail or prove ineffective, then you can actually utilize those other options. Those options are considered restricted. Within literature, you'll find that, and it's specifically because you have to first exhaust the other possibilities. Biodiversity is one that's increasingly receiving attention at a national level. It actually works out very well for a farm to have refuge areas or pollinator areas that provide nectar sources for the various, particularly predatory insects that do a really good job often. Again, a lot of what organic does is try to create a system. Sometimes I think of conventional agriculture is kind of like a toolbox where you have any number of different hammers or whatever in there for whatever happens. With organic, the goal is not to throw away the toolbox, but it's to have a toolbox that you don't visit very often because you're creating a system that prevents the necessity of coming in. And so you don't worry about situations where you're coming in and treating for one pest, but at the same time knocking out your predatory insects that are on your side. And so you don't create imbalances. So you kind of let things try to balance itself out as much as possible. Now, does that always work? No, and that's why there are control methods and options available, but those have limitations.